On the most recent episode of the Maxx Crosby podcast, the Las Vegas Raiders superstar pass rusher was talking a little bit about what the Eagles did to beat the Kansas City Chiefs, and he thinks the Raiders should switch to a focus on basically what the Eagles did in this game. And I want you guys to listen into what Maxx Crosby said, and I want to talk about this on the other side.
Bring four the entire time, and they were beating them up.
Killing them, bro. I literally talked about this with Jim and with Jim Gray earlier. I was like, that game reminded me of 2020 COVID year when Tampa just murdered them up front. They could not stop the 4-man rush. That's what they blitzed 0 times. This is why I always have these arguments with coaches and certain people and philosophies. That's why I believe in the 4-man rush so much. If you have the right guys and y'all are trained the right way, it makes everyone's life easier. If you have 7 guys in the back and you're allowed to go back and cover and double some certain guys and, you know what I mean, give them different looks. If you're having to generate pressure all the time, eventually people are going to start figuring your shit out. You know what I mean? Because there's a lot of holes in the back end. So I think just seeing what Philly did, they had a number 1 defense, number 1 rush game. They just dominated, and they got the players. The player-driven game, period. And they got great coaching. And it was put on full display. They literally did the same thing all year, bro.
So there you guys have it, right? Maxx Crosby's basically putting it out there that the Philadelphia Eagles utilized a 4-man pass rush on pretty much every single play against the Chiefs. In fact, if you guys don't know this, the Eagles literally did not blitz against the Kansas City Chiefs. These guys utilized a true 4-man pass rush 100% of the time, and they dropped 7 guys back into coverage, and they played zone coverage for the most part. And the Kansas City Chiefs had no answer for what the Philadelphia Eagles did, right? And Maxx Crosby's putting it out there. He's basically saying that I always talk about this. Whenever I talk to coaches, whenever I talk about scheme, the best way to win football games is to 4-man pass rush and play coverage. And what Maxx Crosby's saying is so true. And it's so true. And what's crazy about it is it's not just true, but the Raiders aren't that far away from being able to kind of do that a little bit. Right, the Raiders' defensive line is really, really solid, and we saw this during those 9 games with Antonio Pierce, where the Raiders just straight up dominated on the defense side of the football. They really didn't blitz a whole lot during that time, and what they really focused on was 4-man pass rushes. Right, they rushed the quarterback. Now they did blitz heavily against the Los Angeles Chargers, but for the most part, outside that Chargers game, they really just 4-man pass rush, and the Raiders were able to get after it with Malcolm Koonce, Adam Butler, Maxx Crosby, of course. They had a couple guys that kind of rotated in and out. And the Raiders had a lot of success, and I think what Maxx Crosby's saying is so true. Because when you think about what the Philadelphia Eagles did this year, and even the last time they made the Super Bowl, the Eagles were kind of carried by that pass rush. And of course, I know the run game was really solid this year for the Eagles. And then last time, it was really like they brought in A.J. Brown. Him and Hurts had a really good thing going for the offensive side. But the pass rush was still the big factor. The last time the Eagles made the Super Bowl a couple years back, they broke the sack record in that year. And they had an elite pass rush. And of course, that was before Jalen Carter got to the team. At that point, they had Javon Hargrave, who was really, really solid that year for the Eagles. They had a couple other guys as well, right? They had Hassan Riddick that year. They had Brandon Graham, 3 years younger, essentially. They were very, very solid that year. And even this year, they're a lot better, right? And they dominated among the defensive line. And they're young this year, right? And what's crazy is Maxx Crosby basically putting it out there that the Eagles had success beating the Chiefs, really just getting after it with the 4 guys up front. It makes me feel like the Raiders should definitely take that approach as we kind of go forward. Now, we do got to be a little bit honest, right? The Raiders aren't that type of team today. Yes, they have Malcolm Koonce, they have Maxx Crosby, they have Christian Wilkins, they have Adam Butler. And those 4 guys, if they're 100% healthy, are, that's an elite pass rush. Arguably the best pass rush in the NFL. And what's important to understand with that unit is we did have Malcolm Koonce and Adam Butler at huge discounts, right? And that's partly why it was an elite unit. Generally speaking, when Adam Butler gets paid, when Malcolm Koonce get paid, at least on these next contracts, they're going to be north of 10 million. Butler might be between 7 and 10. Koonce is going to be north of 10. All right, Spot Track thinks Koonce is going to make 20 million this year. So, the Raiders might not actually ever see this actually happen, right? But what if there was a way to have an elite pass rush where maybe you bring back Adam Butler, and if Koonce leaves, maybe you replace him with the guy like Abdul Carter or James Pierce Jr., Shamir Stewart from Texas A&M, 6'5", 280 pounds, very athletic. He looks really good as well. And then, of course, maybe Tyree Wilson takes that next step, and Tyree Wilson does a really good job being able to kind of rotate in. And Tyree Wilson plays, the 3-tech, the 4-eye, the 5, and then you can even line him up as like a true edge that speed rushes with that power behind his pads. To me, the Raiders have to really consider doing what Maxx Crosby's saying, right? And the thing that the Eagles were able to do this year, and I kind of want to just touch on it because Patrick Graham did take that same philosophy a lot this past year, right? Patrick Graham, Vic Fangio, they run kind of a similar scheme and system in which Vic Fangio is going to basically keep 2 safeties deep 99% of the time. If you can play a light box and still defend the run, it's very, very, very tough to beat that style of defense. Because when you keep 2 safeties 10, 15 yards back, as an offense, you're not going to beat them over the top. And it's hard going, 10, 11, 12 play drives and scoring touchdowns. That's a hard thing to do, right? The reason why Vic Fangio, in my opinion, is the best defensive coach in the NFL at this point is because of that scheme and system he runs. And he runs it really well. And I think with Patrick Graham, he runs a very, very, very similar scheme. The Raiders can have a lot of success if they kind of, make a couple of changes, right? Obviously, from a roster perspective, Trayvon Merrick, Nate Hobbs, you got to really consider bringing both of those guys back. I think Jack Jones will be a lot better this year, given the fact that you're fully healthy on the defensive line. If the back end's fully healthy as well, I think Jones will be a lot better as well. And then, of course, Corey Bennett looked really good in the time he played last year. If you're the Las Vegas Raiders and you add another defensive lineman, maybe it's a defensive tackle with pick 6, or maybe you wait until the second round because there's a lot of really good defensive tackles in this class, and then maybe you bring back Malcolm Koonce, right? There's just so much the Raiders can do, but the idea of 4-man pass rushes, playing light boxes, and being able to get after the quarterback with just the 4 guys up front, it's the way to win, in my opinion, right? I oftentimes say this, if you guys have followed me, the secondary and linebackers, a lot of that comes down to the actual defensive coordinator. A lot of what happens in the back end, right? And this is why I think sometimes cornerbacks are a little overrated. You'll have guys like Nnamdi Asomugha go from one team and be elite, go to a different team and not have that same success. And Nnamdi's not the only one, right? We've seen guys recently like J.C. Jackson go from the Bill Belichick tree to he leaves and he doesn't look as good. And we've, and truth be told, that happens with a lot of cornerbacks. Trayvon Diggs went from being an elite cornerback with Dan Quinn. Dan Quinn's in the 1 year that Trayvon Diggs was without Dan Quinn, he struggled this past year. And, there's just a bunch of guys that are kind of like that, right? To me, cornerbacks and the secondary a lot of the times is based off of the defensive coordinator and the approach that they kind of have. But pass rush is different. You can't put a guy out there like Tyree Wilson and expect Maxx Crosby results, right? Tyree Wilson is not Maxx Crosby. So if Tyree Wilson was your best defensive lineman, you're not going to have success regardless of that coach back there, right? So one of the things that I truly, truly believe is with the secondary, you let your defensive coordinator figure that out. You take a 2nd, 3rd, 4th round guy, you put him in there, and if it works, it works. You don't have to draft the cornerback high, but with pass rushers, you got to have guys that are actually talented that have a pass rush plan. And I think Maxx Crosby's kind of saying the same thing. And I hope the Raiders actually take this approach seriously. And I hope they actually try to implement that because it's going to allow the Raiders to have the most success as we go into this next season. We'll see what actually ends up happening. And I do want to just give you guys a quick update on Maxx as well. Maxx Crosby said recently that we're just taking it one day at a time, but the rehab of his left ankle injury has been incredible. He said we are in a great place, and he also put it out there that the boot on his ankle will come off next Monday, which is coming up here in a couple of days, right? And to me, this is an important part, right? Because Maxx Crosby, if you guys don't know this about Maxx, from the day the season ends, this guy's in the next Monday. He's in there. He's practicing. He's working. He's getting better. He's getting stronger. He's putting the effort in, right? Maxx Crosby doesn't do what the average person does, right, in the offseason. But this offseason, he hasn't been able to do that because of the fact that he has that boot on his ankle. So he's missed out, a month and a half's worth of training, right? But Maxx Crosby expects to be able to kind of get that off, and then he'll be able to start preparing for next season. And I want you guys to realize, some people are going to say, hey, does it really matter if he takes 2 months off and then starts preparing? It makes a huge difference, right? Remember, Colton Miller did not have an offseason, and when he came into OTAs, I think it was like in April, he didn't run through the drills, and then training camp comes around, he didn't go through the drills, and the guy struggled the first half of this past season, right? I think he gave up the most sacks since his rookie year this past season, and most of that came in that first half. He got better as the season kind of went along. But Maxx Crosby's our best player, right? We need this guy 100% healthy. And I just wanted to give you guys that update, right? The boot is coming off. You can probably get back to it a little bit. And I want to talk to you guys about just a couple more things that have happened here. Pete Carroll, man, and this is really, really cool. Shout out to Bow Tied Raider. He found something tied to Pete Carroll that was in a Sports Illustrated article from a couple years back. And this really just talks about like the culture and the type of person Pete Carroll is. And I think it's pretty cool. I want to read this to you guys because I think it's super, super cool. So Golden Tate, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, he said, talking in about Pete Carroll, just kind of telling a story about Pete Carroll. He said, hey, we've got this. He said one team meeting Pete Carroll gets up there in front of the team and he says the following. Pete Carroll says, hey, we've got this new Gatorade. Why don't you guys make sure you try it out before practice? They're supposed to hydrate you really well. We don't want you out here pulling anything. So Pete Carroll went up there and he told the entire team that. And then Golden Tate goes on to say, we would open up the cooler and this fake snake would pop out. We'd all jump and some of us would scream. He had a camera in there, of course. The next day in the team meeting, he selected all the good ones and premiered it to the entire team. To me, that's funny, right? And that's the type of person Pete Carroll is, right? This guy cracks jokes. He makes fun of things, right? He has fun out there. And it's refreshing to know that this is the type of coach the Raiders will have. I don't want a coach that's like super serious the way Josh McDaniels was, right? If you guys remember, when we went from Josh McDaniels as super strict, super like, on top of things, not even on top, but he was super strict, very, very aggressive about it's the Patriot way or whatever. And then remember when he got fired and Antonio Pierce came in 2 weeks later, they're playing basketball and smoking cigars. Like the entire thing flipped. And the thing is the players made it known at that point that Josh McDaniels was way too strict, right? This guy was not having fun out there. That was not fun, right? And we've heard people even talk about Bill Belichick saying the same thing, that, hey, it's not fun being in that locker room. And, Bill Belichick's different because he's won Super Bowls, but Josh McDaniels has never won Super Bowls. Pete Carroll, love the fact that this guy has not only won Super Bowls, but he has fun as well. And there's another one that I want to kind of show you guys. Malcolm said that Pete Carroll hosted scooter races in the coach's office. There was a loop that he'd set up, and he would do timed scooter races. And then someone else said, I was excited every day to go to work because what is Pete going to do today? What fun thing is he going to bring up? Brett said he would have a set amount of time in the day allocated to just having pure fun. It's just funny, right? It's just funny to me. Pete Carroll obviously is the type of person that's not too serious. But when he has to be serious, he'll be serious, right? And I just found this cool, so I just wanted to show it to you guys. This is the type of coach that the Raiders are going to get. Pete Carroll might not be here long, right? 3 years is what his contract is, and then it's a 4th year. I think that 4th year is a Pete Carroll option, or it might be a team option. Don't quote me on which way it is, but Pete Carroll might actually just retire right after that, right? Which is why in yesterday's video, I talked a little bit about some of the veterans and those type of things. So I did a mock draft earlier, and I put this on Twitter this morning, where I said the Las Vegas Raiders should bring back Malcolm Koonce, Nate Hobbs, Trayvon Merrick, Adam Butler, Robert Spillane, and then they should add Aaron Rodgers as their quarterback. And then, of course, I think we'd be legit next year with the draft focus on adding playmakers and an all-pro caliber guard like Anthony Belton, who can also play right tackle. So I did this mock draft, essentially, right? And I put out my opinion on what I think the Raiders should do from this point as we kind of go forward. As I mentioned, Pete Carroll, he's not going to be here long term. He's not going to be here for 20 years, right? He's just not, right? But Pete Carroll will be here for the next 3 to 4 years. So you have a good staff for the next 3 to 4 years. And it's not just Pete Carroll, right? Chip Kelly's a head coaching candidate. Patrick Graham's a head coaching candidate. Those two guys might not be here in 2 to 4 years either, right? And I think for the Raiders, you should try to capitalize on that coaching staff. And I 100% agree with this, and I 100% believe this. Jalen Hurts was not the reason why the Philadelphia Eagles won a Super Bowl, right? They won a Super Bowl because they had a good roster and they had a good offensive coordinator. They had a good defensive line, right? They won a roster not because of their quarterback, but because of everything else, right? If you put Jalen Hurts on the Raiders this year and every year prior to this, he wouldn't win anything, right? And I'm not saying Jalen Hurts is a bad quarterback. I'm just stating a fact. You can have success without a great quarterback, but you got to have a great staff in place, right? And I think Kellen Moore just worked really well for this scheme and system. And I think Vic Fangio was obviously, best defensive coach in the NFL. And I think for the Raiders, if you consider the fact that our staff is legit this year, if you consider the fact that Brock Bowers, Jackson Powers-Johnson, even Colton Miller to an extent are on cheaper contracts than where their value kind of is, I would make the argument the Raiders are in a really good place. If they're able to just add a couple pieces, they can actually compete, right? Like, yeah, you might go into this season, and it doesn't have to be Aaron Rodgers. It could be Matthew Stafford. It could be maybe one of these other quarterbacks. Russell Wilson could also potentially give you an option with that. But I think Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford are a lot better than Russell Wilson. And I think all three of those guys are better than Justin Fields. I know Fields could be a long-term option, but I'm thinking specifically try to compete for the next couple of years. If you do bring back Malcolm Koonce, you have a good defensive line. If you bring in Hobbs and Merrick and Spillane, you have a good second and third level of your defense. And then imagine if you go out there and say, we're going to take the best wide receiver available, right? And you get T-Mac or Tetra McMillan, who is like 6'5". He's massive. He's a good route runner. He's very similar to Drake London, where, if McMillan's your true number one wide receiver, if he's that true X, you got to double team this guy because he's bigger than most corners and he can move. He can run routes. He's not like a slow receiver that can't really move. Like McMillan's a legit wide receiver. And to me, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, right? So you revamp, you bring back your free agents, you roll in this year with the same guys from last year on the defensive side. And then on the offensive side, you add a veteran quarterback and you add guys like Tetro McMillan. In the second round, you add a running back in Caleb Johnson. In the third round, you add Anthony Belton. And I don't think Belton's going to go 68th overall the way he was in the PFF mock draft simulator. I think Anthony Belton's closer to a top 20 pick than the 68th overall pick. But if you do somehow land Anthony Belton, the idea behind this was that Belton can play guard, right? You can put him in that left guard or right guard, wherever you want. He could probably also play tackle, to be honest. But I think Anthony Belton comes into the NFL, and within 2 years, he's a top 3 guard. Like, I think he has that type of upside at that guard position. You're essentially adding a guard. You're adding arguably the second best running back in Caleb Johnson. You add arguably one of the top 2 wide receivers in Tetra McMillan. That paired up with what you already kind of have with Brock Bowers, with Trey Tucker, with Jacoby Myers, Jackson Powers-Johnson, Colton Miller. DJ Glaze showed some upside. You throw in Anthony Belton. You can roll with Parham or get another guy. And then you add another running back in Quinshon Judkins. And I want to talk about adding 2 running backs, within the top 3 rounds. Caleb Johnson, to me, is one of the best running backs in this class. He's an elite running back. Quinshon Judkins out of Ohio State is also an elite running back. The Raiders don't have any elite running backs on this roster right now. You look at the Lions had, they have one elite running back and they have a second that's very, very good. In fact, the Lions' second running back is better than all the running backs we had this past season. And there's other teams that have 2 good running backs. You can look at the San Francisco 49ers, who have had Christian McCaffrey, but for some reason they're still drafting running backs in the second, third, fourth round every year, basically, right? You look at some other teams around the NFL. The Kansas City Chiefs have multiple weapons, right? They have multiple running backs. They have multiple wide receivers that are coming in and out every other year, right? If you're the Raiders, adding 2 running backs isn't just 2 running backs. You're adding playmakers, right? Quinshon Judkins can line up in the slot, and you can put him into motion on any given play and hand him the football. On any given play, you can have Caleb Johnson in the backfield and hand him the football. To me, adding 2 running backs, you're adding 2 weapons, right? And these guys aren't going to run the ball 30 times. That's not what the Raiders are doing in my mock draft. They're adding playmakers. They're adding 2 running backs, 2 guys that could come in and have success. And I don't care if guys are 1,500-yard guys. That's not how you win football games. I care about the number of touches Caleb Johnson gets, Quinshon Judkins gets. You throw in T-Mac as well as that true X. You throw in Brock Bowers, right? To me, that's an elite offense. And if you can get a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers or Matthew Stafford, and it has to be one of those 2 guys because those guys are actual elite quarterbacks. They're not similar to Russell. I don't think Russell Wilson's an elite quarterback. He's good, but he's not elite. He's like Kirk Cousins, right? They're good, not elite. Justin Fields, long-term, I would not go down that path. If you're going to go long-term, just draft the quarterback, right? And then, of course, just a couple other guys that I kind of threw in here. Jordan Phillips, underrated defensive tackle. Braden Swinson, I think he's actually a first-round pick, but PFF gave me an F for taking him in the 5th round. It's kind of crazy. You can take a quarterback to develop under a veteran quarterback. I think that's always a smart thing to do. I actually went back and looked at all the different quarterbacks that have been drafted outside of the top 2 rounds, and there's not a lot. There's only like 3 or 4 quarterbacks that get drafted outside the first 2 rounds. A lot of them are the premier backups though at this point, right? Like, Joshua Dobbs, for example, or Geno Smith prior to him becoming an actual elite or not elite, but a really good quarterback. Hendon Hooker, another guy, second round pick. I think the Raiders would be smart to draft a quarterback late and see if that guy has some upside, right? Cameron Jackson's another guy that I really, really like. Again, if you're the Raiders, you got to add some depth on the inside, especially if you don't retain Adam Butler. Essapol's a guy that I think is underrated. I think he could be a long-term tackle in the NFL. Joshua Gray, of course, very solid interior guy. I think most people know who that is. I did this mock draft. I think if the Raiders followed exactly what I'm saying right here, I think we are competing for a Super Bowl this year, right? I really, really do think that. I know some people are going to say, hey, that's not realistic. I think it is. The Commanders went from the 2nd overall pick to literally the championship game, right? In same year, basically, right? You draft the quarterback and you're there. The Texans, 2 straight playoff berths from the number 2 overall pick to 2 straight playoff berths, right? We've seen teams make this jump. The Chiefs, although they made the playoffs with Andy Reid, basically haven't not made a Super Bowl since the time they brought in Patrick Mahomes. And they've kind of been the same team, right? Like they've always kind of drafted well when Andy Reid was there. To me, I don't think the Raiders aren't a team that can't, make that push. The difference between a bottom 5 team when it comes to draft position and a top 5 team is really not that big of a difference. Really, it comes down to coaching staff. Sometimes it's your quarterback, but really it's your coaching staff and just kind of adding playmakers and kind of getting better. But let's wrap it up. Final update here. Really not that crazy of an update, but Luke Getsy, man, has gotten another job with the Green Bay Packers as a senior offensive assistant. Kind of interesting that Luke Getsy continues to get jobs, but I understand, there's not a lot of people that understand football and that language that happens within the game of football. He's going to be obviously with Matt LaFleur, who he's been with in the past. Just kind of interesting. Just wanted to kind of throw it out there. Let me know what you guys think, man. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We're at the point now as we kind of go forward where there's not going to be a whole lot of updates coming out. We will have random days in the next month where the Raiders will release, player X, they'll release player Y. They might trade for a guy at some point whenever that kind of starts. And then we'll start hearing about free agencies, right? Like there's going to be a time probably in the first week of March. I know you're not supposed to until March 10th, but in the first week of March, you'll start to hear reports. Hey, the Raiders are interested in Christian Wilkins. This guy's interested in this team or whatever. It's going to start, right? So I hope you guys all have a great day. Hope you guys enjoy the weekend, and I will see you guys next time with another video.